Thank you. Morning, welcome. Thanks for coming. This morning I'm going to be talking about the minimum viable organisation. My name's Tom. I work as a coach, and I've performed or been involved in many agile transformations, and I've been on a quest for what the minimum viable organisation is. And in using that, I should define what I mean by that. That collection of terms to mean what the collection of words means. The smallest group of people that are in roles not directly adding value, but with a shared purpose that are required to achieve success. So a successful minimal amount of structure that's not just adding value. And we work in organizations that have more than just value-adding roles. So what is the minimum viable organization? It's a one-man band, fully autonomous, cross-functional. So he can achieve anything, just adds value. That's it. It's simpler than I thought. Do we have time for questions? No, really. I work in orgs that look more like this. Massive things that are massive amounts of interactions, massive amounts of people, processes, complex structures, very hard to maneuver, hard to reverse the whole thing. And a lot of them are very bloated and inefficient. And working in those organizations, I often question the structure of those things and the sheer amount of management and bloat and inefficiency in those things. And my job as a coach is to hopefully make them better, make them leaner. And that drives me on my search to see what is the amount of structure that is useful for those companies in order to be successful. Now, many years ago, I worked with a friend, my mate Steve, and he used to quote this a lot. He was an extreme leanist, and he would say, all management is waste, Tom. And that got me thinking, well, if that's true, if I take the definition that anything that's not directly adding value, directly touching a product is waste, by that definition, management is waste. Therefore, we should remove it all. And I struggled with that in those big oil tanker organizations I work in. That looks at a remote possibility, and is that even desirable? Is it right that we should have no management at all? But it got me thinking about, well, what is management actually doing? What are roles above team actually doing? And I'm going to take you on a journey. So organizations transform in many different ways, and I've been involved in a few. Some of the most radical I've been involved in, you get a head of department, and he or she says, right, I'm going to completely bust open my organization. I like the idea of this concept of a feature team. So I want to just create loads of feature teams. So what then happens is all managers get pushed down into feature teams in this organization structure. Some will leave some management in, but I've been in some fantastic transformations where they've just basically removed everything. No structure in the middle. There's just feature teams, just value. It's brilliant. And you get this void in the middle. And the problem is some nasty things start to happen because we've only transformed a little bit of the organization. And this is best described, I think, by Dr. Seuss. If you know Dr. Seuss, I'm going to have to read this because his prose is much better than mine. Oh, the jobs people work at, out west near Horch. There's a Horch, a bee watcher. His job is to watch. Is to keep both his eyes on the lazy town bee. A bee that is watched will work harder, you see. Well, he watched and he watched, but in spite of his watch, that bee didn't work any harder, not much. So then somebody said, our old bee watching man just isn't bee watching as hard as he can. He ought to be watched by another Horcher. The thing that we need is a bee watcher. Well, the bee watcher watched the bee watcher. He didn't watch well, so another Horcher had to come in as a watcher. And today, all the Horchers who live in Horch are watching on watching the watcher who's watching that bee. You're not a Horcher, you're lucky, you see. And this is... But this is what happens. You've exposed the bee. Now all those feature teams are the bees, and people can just watch the bee. And in fact, they do more than watch the bee. They start disrupting the bee. They start asking the bee for stuff because they're not getting their stuff anymore. And what's happened is we've updated part of the organization. We've transformed a little bit. We haven't transformed this much broader scope of things. We've got I don't know, in some cases it might just be IT. We might do IT in the business, but there's support, there's project management, change functions, there's HR, there's legal, there's audit, compliance, all these other parts of the organization that we haven't updated. And they want information. They may go away for a bit when this new Agile thing comes along, but they'll come back twice as hard, needing information. And if we haven't updated them, we haven't changed the way we're working with them, updated our interface into those parts of the organization, they don't know how to ask for stuff. It gets very messy. We can't communicate in the same way. We can't provide information the same way. We're being asked for all these massive reports that we don't understand how to provide anymore. And the organization starts breaking down. We start getting mass confusion and hysteria. So what a lot of organizations I work with do is they add managers back in. Yeah, like Power Rangers to save the day. They come back in and they make more of a mess. They tend to start micromanaging. They start taking over, removing self-organization for teams, sort of creating things for themselves to do. Because often no one's actually updated management with what leadership looks like in this new world, in this new agile, transformed world. And often the training we do is often at team level. So we'll do certified Scrum Master and team level introduction to Agile. We might do a little bit of stakeholder engagement, but very few places I've worked, we really work on leadership and how leadership looks like and what they should be doing in this new structure, how much of it's enough. And I think a common misconception, no managers doesn't equal no leadership to me, and often by pushing managers into teams and just saying get on and do some work, they kind of somehow lose that leadership. They haven't worked out yet what leadership looks like in a new environment. And that started getting me to thinking about what is it about organizational design and organizational behaviors and thinking that create that kind of view. Now, I've bumped into a very interesting piece of work by a guy called Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organizations. And in that, he tells about the evolution of organizations through human history. And he starts hundreds of thousands of years, we had no organization design at all. It was basically just small clans of hundreds of people, maximum. And then gradually, something evolved called red organizations, which he terms red organizations, where basically you're now operating in thousands. And what they've done is they've put a leader in, they've put a clan chief in, and the clan chief now makes decisions, will be the one who rewards or punishes. So you end up with this top-down structure, but this allowed organizations to operate in the thousands. And now that started building things like they were able to explore new territory, and they were able to specialize and division of labor. So we innovated some developments in organizational design. Beyond that, around 4000 BC, Mesopotamia, some civilizations started to emerge, and those civilizations were built on the order of gods, deigned rules that we live to, and this is ruled order. It's replicable process, big stable structure, very much a class-oriented thing. So where you are in that structure is how you're rewarded by that. But again, another evolution that allowed us to start working in many thousands. In the last few hundred years, organizations have started, the Industrial Revolution and scientific method and thinking has started to evolve organizations into really thinking about, well, how can we make money out of this? How can we operate as a big meritocracy where now I can be rewarded based on what I can achieve. Anyone can achieve anything in this design. And in here, we're looking at sort of, we're out for finance. We see those rules, but those rules are no longer immutable. We can challenge them and explore them and exploit them for financial gain. And here we have, big top-down hierarchies, but based around, financial gain. And most of the companies, certainly I work with today, there's a lot of orange-type thinking in those organizations. That's how they're structured, and they've been that way for many years. Typified by like Wall Street, the financial firms on Wall Street, and I work with a lot of financial institutions. And here's where it gets interesting for me, green organizations. So he calls green organizations are much more values-oriented. So here's where, for me, it starts to sort of equate with a lot of what we do in the Agile transformation world is we start thinking about empowerment, teams, self-organization. We start thinking more than just shareholder value. We start thinking stakeholder value, employee value and customer value more. And we become much more values-driven. And that's where I think a lot of the Agile methods and Agile values and principles come into play. But with a lot of organizations that are very orange in their nature, it becomes very hard to start working that way. They've got these structures in place, and there's a lot of conflict between those two ideals. So a lot of organizations I work with that are trying to be more green-oriented really struggle with how to release that tension of orange, and they end up still with a lot of structure in place. And I think a lot of organizations are still trying to work through this model. What do we need to do to evolve and change and become much more green in nature? Beyond that, Laloux talks about teal organizations, which there's a fair bit of buzz around at the minute. And in these organisations, really, this is where people, in his view, I think he's saying that people are now bored with work. They want more from life than, I turn up to work, I work for a long time. I want more out of it than that. I want to feel like I belong to this thing, that, I identify with this organisation I'm working with. And in here, you have a sort of wholeness, a moral compass. I make decisions because I feel they're the right thing to do. And I believe in the purpose of this company. And in these organisations, you have true self-management, so very little management. And there's some great examples of these. Buurtzorg, I might have murdered the name for Dutch speakers, but Buurtzorg is a Netherlands nursing institution. And basically, nursing was costing a shed load of money and was basically centralised, and orange thinking came in and they hit targets. They had centralised call centres. Everyone hated it. And this guy, Jos de Blok, set up Buurtzorg as in response to that. He quit his job and set up this organisation. And they are around 8,000 to 9,000 people, and they have like 25 people in the middle of the organisation, all doing just administrative help. No managers at all. It's fantastic read in how they do that. Some of the practices from there are actually quite interesting to try and apply, and that's sort of, I've been trying to get that thinking and bake it in. And there's some other interesting companies there, Morningstar and Semco and various others that are operating at significant scale, but on really well self-managed with very limited amounts of structure up above. And so this thinking really started helping me think about, well, the organizations I work with, how are they actually structured? What are their values? The different parts of those organizations, they're not just green or orange. Because they're made up of different people with different worldviews, there's whole bunches of these, different parts of the organization in different models and different ways of working. It also made me think, I was thinking the wrong way about this. I'd got it wrong, at least partly. All I was thinking about in minimum viability was, what's the leanest thing that I can create? How can I reduce costs, stripe out all the waste, get rid of everything, make it as lean and as efficient as possible? But I was ignoring kind of these values and how the company was actually made around the values and people identifying with those values. And so it made me think that a lot of things need to be rebooted, need to be upgraded. One of which is leadership. So that the no managers doesn't equal no leadership thing, for me, is a real change in how leaders think about their role in an organisation. And there's a fantastic book from Michael and Freddie Ballet, Lead with Respect. And in that, the central character, Jane, the CEO, she's being coached in Lean. And she's coached to basically always ask the question, whenever you see a problem, always ask the question, the problem is me. Start with me as the problem. If I consider myself as the owner of this system, how can I do something to change the system, to change the outcome, the characteristics of this system? Rather than just blaming teams or getting in and fixing it myself, what are the things that I can start doing to help teams start taking ownership of these problems themselves, start coaching them, start helping them teach them their own way of problem solving? And so a lot of the time now I work with leaders to start thinking, right, if we own the system, if as a leader you're not working in the system anymore, you're working on the system, what are the things that you can do to start helping that system become more self-organized? And so what I've done in that time is start thinking about leadership in a different way. Now, there's probably many other models of leadership, but this is certainly one of the way I've started working with leaders in companies I work with. So there's the leader as a mentor. So being able to teach problem solving to teams, working with teams on different ways of exploring the problems for themselves and teaching them the skills they need to be able to solve their own problems, teaching them cross-functional learning, things like, how do we identify the skills we need to be a well-balanced, well-drilled team? How do we look at other parts of the organization and work out how we need to interact with them and become self-sufficient and more resilient in the process? How do we share knowledge in a better way? So, I can find something good in one place and I could take it to another place and disperse that knowledge. Or even better, how do I create a system whereby people are sharing knowledge in and amongst themselves, that knowledge becomes something that we see for ourselves something good and we want to share it with others. Then there's the leader as a change agent. So in making some of the changes that we need to transform, there's going to be a whole bunch of structural change needed. So we're going to have to update a lot of other parts of the organization. How do I go about thinking about that? What are those other parts of the organization? What is the interface we have with them today? How do we operate with them today? And how do I go about influencing those other parts of the organization? there's a lot around sort of the boundaries and constraints we're working with in teams. Teams I still think, need to know where their boundaries, where the things that they own and the things that are within their sphere of influence, and trying to evolve that sphere of influence wider over time. So understanding those boundaries and constraints, setting them, being clear about them, working out ways, what am I delegating down, who owns what, and how do they own it, how do I increase that sphere of influence to teams, and how do I work on the boundaries to other parts of the organisation. And influencing and connecting. So a lot of leaders will have big networks. There'll be influential people often who will know a lot of people in the organisation. They can help connect teams to other parts of the organisation and build their own influence that way. So they can use that influence to help break out into other parts of the organisation and help the teams that work with them break out into other parts of the organisation and build their own networks from that. And always addressing the status quo. So never standing still, never letting what is today be the way it should be, always attacking and thinking there must be a different way of doing this. How do we continuously improve? How do we assess and keep evolving the system we work in? And being an exemplar of culture. So, and by that I mean sort of living the values. I think I'm a firm believer that people follow the actions of management, whether that be because you admire someone who you follow and you want to follow in their footsteps and follow their mode of leadership, or whether it be that you just think that's the way that stuff gets done around here, so I'll follow the same suit. But we tend to follow in the actions of leadership, and I think leaders can't just be a do as I preach and not as I do. I think leaders need to extol those values. And in so doing, driving out command and control culture, so looking for ways in which they can create and foster more self-management and self-organisation in teams. Building a complete culture of learning, and that's not just every 6 months I'll do an appraisal and tell you whether you're doing well. It's not whether every so often you can go on a conference or training. It's how do you constantly evolve learning, constantly keep learning. And build a coaching culture where coaching just becomes part of life. Everyone needs mentoring. I need mentoring. All leaders need mentoring. All teams need mentoring. Everyone needs mentoring in different things. And they might want to learn and expand their horizons into all kinds of new things. And we should be able to create an environment that supports that, which will make, in the process, that increased learning will give people much more of a sort of worldview, mindset of being able to own the organisation and self-manage in a much better way and have much more skills in order to do that. And so, updating leadership and working with leadership has led me to a whole bunch of new practices, which I'll run through now. And these are ways of upgrading, I think, our interactions within teams, with leaders, and with all other parts of the organizations we work in. So one thing we've been doing is looking at, I've split these into things that I've roughly compartmentalized them into. Fostering self-organisation. So if we believe in self-organisation and even self-management, then we need to be pushing and getting teams to own a lot more for themselves. So as a leader, I can get rid of appraisals for myself. How about if I push appraisals down to the team and give them ownership of that? And we've been running a bunch of practices where we give teams ownership of appraisals. So and by that I mean, this is part of your compensation. So it's not just the manager decides what you get rewarded. This is your team decide what you get rewarded. And that has some interesting implications. When we implement this, we call it sort of 360 reviews and stuff. And actually, a team member will sit down on their own and say, right, in this last 6 months, I feel I've developed in this way, but I've had these problems this way. And I know there was that incident, and I was upset about that. And people tend to be very self-critical, and often the team around them will say, well, actually, that wasn't so bad. You actually did this, which really helped me out. And yeah, I know there was that one issue, but we worked around that, and that was fine. What it does, as well as teams become accountable for making sure they're delivering into the team because they're answering to the team, it builds a lot stronger team and a lot sort of tighter, closer relationship within that team, and they become more self-organised, more resilient as a result of that. Freedom with fences and expert advice is something I like. So freedom with fences is basically giving autonomy but within constraints. So I might give you a budget of £20,000, or I might give you a certain time that you can spend, and you can do whatever you like with that time. But the rule is you have to seek some expert advice. So I give you autonomy, but our bond is that you will have to go and seek some experts within the organization. And a lot of the teal organizations use this as a way of self-managing. You go and seek who is an expert in that, and you get 3 opinions for something. And you take those opinions back, and then you make your own decision based on that information. You're close to the action, and with that expert advice, you're bound to come up with actually a lot better decision than a whole bunch of than a manager will. With you're given 4 seconds and given 3 bullet points on an option, and they pick one. So that's a way of building a lot more self-organisation. Trying to enable leadership a bit more, so much more leadership coaching. And in fact, an organisation I'm working with now is using a lot of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, to help leaders think much more about, rather than just sort of the basically neuro levels, at the bottom levels, they're like the environment I work in, the actions and the behaviors of people working within the organization. Beyond that, thinking about what drives those behaviors is actually the values and beliefs we have and the identity we have. And above that, that's driven by purpose. So starting to get leaders to think about what really is the purpose of what we're doing, what are the values we're looking at, and working back down the other way will start to change their behaviors and the actions that they take and how they want to change the environment. So really giving leaders coaching in how to think. And Gemba, so a lot of managers will just sit in an office and they'll think that's the normal way to manage, or they're just on the phone all the time because everyone wants information from them, and they rarely visit teams. Getting managers to go and interact and go to Gemba, go to the shop floor, go and see what's happening is a fantastic way of them being able to start fostering more self-organisation, for them being able to help teams. And runs this concept of Abaya rooms, which again I think comes from Toyota. And this is where basically we create a central room in the middle where management will go to that room and teams will go to that room when they've got a problem or when they want to discuss a new project or a new thing. And basically they'll bring all the data they can and they'll plaster this room in data, and everyone will collaborate over the problem and look at the data and analyze it and work together with management to start thinking about different ways that they can solve problems. And it's a fantastic way of just building collaboration and for management to be able to interact with the teams they're working with. Another thing around creating a learning organisation. So I mentioned a coaching culture, and we've started in some companies creating a mentoring marketplace. So basically, if I want to learn about a skill, I can go to the marketplace, and as a mentee, I can go and seek a mentor in a different part of the organisation. I might be able to want to select someone who's not in my immediate part of the organisation, and creating a marketplace where I can go and find others who will give me that mentorship and create long-lasting bonds with other parts of the organisation creates this much bigger network of influence and a much healthier organisation, and gives everyone access to mentoring. So other things like creating a big open source library of information, and I open source, well curated information that's central, not just pockets of wikis within different parts of the organization, but a true central open source library of information for people. And creating like freedom of feet, so being able to move around the organization. So not just get mentoring, but long-lived teams are great, but sometimes I may want to work on something different. And being able to create that freedom to travel and move around the organization is something that is often overlooked, and I think actually it's very rewarding for people. They feel they might not need to move to another organisation, they might not be limited, they can move about, and that becomes an encouraged thing to do. Metrics and measurements, so becoming much more sort of metric oriented, thinking about what are the things that we measure ourselves by, and how do they change our behaviours. So we use a lot of impact metrics, so measuring actual business outcomes. So building operational dashboards and driving our thinking by how we're affecting the business, but also our values as well. How do we put our values into metrics? And changing the way we look at productivity. So rather than just story points or something like that, do we look at things like lead time and throughput and some more systemic metrics and use those to drive the way we do stuff? But getting a balanced scorecard of stuff that isn't just productivity, it's human evolution or enjoyment and satisfaction, motivation, those kind of things. And lastly, driving continuous improvement, and there's a whole bunch of tools there. I've just put a few up there. So using, and again, these are good ways for management actually to interact or again, teach more self-organization and drive that thinking down into teams. Things like value stream maps, where you're looking at the whole process and trying to drive out waste and something. A3s for problem solving. We use plan, do, check, act boards, Deming cycle boards, where Teams will come up with experiments. They'll put small experiments up on a board, and management can come and ask them how they're working with that experiment. What's their thinking behind that? How are you getting on with this thing? Is there any help you need? Do you need to talk to other parts of the organization? How can I use my influencing and connecting skills to help you with that? And lastly, sort of a real-time system retro, and by system I mean just our department as a system. Being able, anyone at any point, being able, and you see real-time retrospectives at conferences often, where people just put in things they like and dislike. Why not put that in your organization? We've started putting that there, and people will just put up things as they emerge, things that they need help with, and things that they find interesting or funny about the organization, and creating that as a sort of real-time retrospective, and then having a group sort of think about some of the things that are on there. People can vote and mark against things that they find interesting, and then we can have a conversation around those, and leadership can interact with those and work out, how do they need to change their thinking or change the organization to help that. So these are a whole bunch of new practices that are updating our practice set. So we're thinking about updating leadership. And in the process of updating this practice set, I think we build self-organizing and self-managing teams that by their very nature require less structure, less management interaction and involvement. With that, thank you. My final offering to you, or something to think about, is start assessing and thinking about the sort of organizations you work in, those colors of organizational thinking, the departments in and around your organization. How do they think? How do they act? What are the values? If your company, many companies will have a value statement, a mission statement, which will be very value-oriented. How do you really live up to that? How do management behave towards that? Do they live those values? Do they teach those values and behave like that? And all other parts of the organization. How are people appraised and rewarded? Is failure really okay? We hear that a lot, that it's good to fail fast, fail all the time. How is that actually dealt with? And is it encouraged? Is it supported? Is it nurtured? And the learning from that nurtured. And lastly, how do you update the interfaces to the other parts of the organization when you're transforming, so you don't end up with that big mess of people asking for various information, miscommunication and so on? How can you build new interfaces, build new practices, new ways of working with other parts of the organization, such that you can build a much more of a self-managed system that will support each other, that will communicate. Maybe you can align much better if you understand each other a lot more. So working with other parts of the organization and not working against them. So how can you adapt your practices to do that? And I guess the message there is, anyone in any position can learn to help your organization learn, not just managers, teams. All of us can help adapt our ways of thinking such that we require less structure because we become more self-managed, more self-organized. Thank you. Yep. Right, so and obviously the context is king on that one, but so often I've worked with leaders to acknowledge their style of leadership and how they're thinking in that leadership model. And I mentioned the neuro-linguistic levels. I found that a really useful tool for getting them to think about the environment they're in and the behaviors that they are taking on, and this is an individual thing, their behaviors, and really looking at how their behaviors affect others and the values that actually we want to work towards. This may involve someone senior setting those values with those leaders, and it's not that we can't necessarily just push up and change leaders ourselves. It needs probably some interaction from up above as well, but really assessing those values and the identity that we want to create as a company, and those managers need to believe those values and buy into those values. But those neuro levels force them to assess the values that they're using and look at the purpose and look at how they might change their behaviors if they really want to live to those values. But I think that requires some coaching and some interaction from maybe externally or from other leaders within the organization and their peers. And as I think within teams, we need to hold them to account to live to that in whatever ways and productive ways we can.
Okay. Anyone? Question?
Thank you for that. Great talk. How do you deal with the silent plotters and the naysayers, not necessarily managers, as people in the business that just don't want to change? You know, there's some radical concepts here going from, red to orange, etc. How do you, any strategies, ideas on how you help people through that?
So, good shout. I think personal experience, I think there is a weight of numbers thing that if more and more of us act in this way and encourage each other to act in this way, then it becomes harder to resist. There's, the curve of early adopters to late adopters and so on. The more and more people that think that way, the harder it becomes to resist that, I think, to a certain extent. Yeah, other than that, I think, again, leaders need to, I guess, call that out. Making teams, so there's an interesting thing I've found in that sort of the 360 appraisal thing, the making teams accountable for appraising each other means that actually they form a social norm and a bond, and they're accountable for that. So they actually, that I've seen has led to, sometimes it leads to people leaving because they just cannot work in that way, and that's fair enough, that's their choice. But it kind of, by pushing that down to teams and they kind of they will do it themselves, given the right support to do that, and they will help. Typically, they'll try and help people along as far as they can, and they'll want to work with people. People generally want to collaborate and work with each other. So I think putting that structure in teams and them setting their own goals and saying, yeah, this is the way we work, hopefully helps people adapt and try and get over those hurdles. And that's certainly my experience.
Last chance for anyone to ask a question. Okay.
How do you avoid that startups, they have it more easily to start with a greener organization, but then they are growing very rapidly? And how do you avoid that they start to go rather in the other direction and go to more orange? Or
Right, an interesting shout. I've tended to work with oil tankers, so I've not seen that from personal experience. I guess thinking on my feet, I would say we need to be very clear in our values and the practices needed to support that structure. And I guess thinking about our organizational design and how we live those values so that we don't end up in that position. But I guess that's going to come down to the thinking of the people involved. So if people think in an orange way when they start up, most of this thinking starts at the top. So I think if the CEO starts a startup and it becomes bigger, is an orange thinker predominantly, the company will start becoming orange because people will follow that leadership style, and that it will cascade down. So I think that way of thinking and that way of design will come from the way that those companies are managed and set up from the start. But I think certainly there's a way of thinking about the design and thinking about the practices and the way all parts of the organization need to interact. As you start building out legal and HR departments and stuff, thinking about how those things should be designed up front and how the values that we should live to, I think is going to be important. But I think it starts at the top. Thank you.